Us.
No, thank you. Isn't no. Sorry, not this. Okay.
Swipe the position for second display.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Daniel Ehrenberg, and I wanted to tell you about two new language feature proposals that are being developed for JavaScript. Optional chaining, this question mark dot, and nullish coalescing, question mark, question mark. Just a little bit about me. I work for a consultancy called Igalia, which is it's a cooperative, and we work on free software. And as part of our partnership with Bloomberg, I'm a delegate of TC39, the group that designs the JavaScript programming language, including new changes. So first, let's talk about why we might want to make these new language features. And let's start with optional chaining. This can provide safe property access. What do we mean by safe? So, for example, let's say we have an array of objects representing people. These objects are alike in some ways and not alike in other ways. They each have a name, for example, Dan Ehrenberg or John Doe, but then some have a passport or some have a date of birth. So here we want to get out all the passport numbers. And maybe we could do that with this function map. The method map on array.prototype takes a function as an argument and applies that function to each element of the array and returns a new array with that as the result. So what happens if we get person.passport.number for each person in the people array? It doesn't actually work because John Doe doesn't have a passport. John Doe's passport would be undefined because when you access a property that's missing, the answer is undefined. And then accessing the property number on such an undefined throws a type error. So this will not work. What we have to do is use a more complicated function. So instead of getting person.passport.number on any person, first check if person.passport is there, then return that. Otherwise, return undefined. This is a bit wordy, so there's a shorter way to write it. You can use and. So you can say person.passport and person.passport.number. And what this will do is and if it's false, if the thing on the left of the end is false, then it'll return the thing on the left. And otherwise, it'll return the thing on the right. So if person.passport is undefined, it'll return undefined. And if it's not undefined, then it'll read person.passport.number and has this property it's called short-circuiting, in that it doesn't evaluate the right unless the left is true. With the optional chaining feature, this could be slightly different. We could instead write person.passport $.number. Well, is that really worth it? Why would we want to make such a change? One reason is to avoid repetition. With and, especially if we get into looking into deep properties, then we end up repeating ourselves a lot. We have to say a.b, a.b.c, a.b.c.d. In this way, we can just use saying each thing one time. And each time you do ? dot, that means, skip the rest of this expression if it turns out it was undefined. But there's a more serious problem, which is falsiness. So if we try to use this and pattern, or the same as if we try to use an if statement, if you do 0 on the left-hand side of and, you're going to get 0. You're not going to get the thing that's on the right-hand side. So even if we're trying to, say, convert the B property to a string if it's there, this is not going to get a string as a result. It's going to get 0 as a result. So JavaScript has 6 different values, or, well, a number of different values that will be treated as false in a conditional. You have 0, false, undefined, null, and empty string, and they all go into the else case rather than the if case. So these values are called falsy, and the values that don't go into this category are called truthy. It's sort of a made-up word for talking about the JavaScript language. And and or work similarly. So for and, you can see that for these 5, we get this falsy value as a result of and rather than the 1. Whereas for true, we get 1 as a result. When you use ? dot, we're not depending on this falsiness property. You can do a ? dot, b ? dot, toString, and we'll get 0 in strings as a result. Look, this feature is really popular among different programming languages. It just is a more intuitive way to write out the logic that you're going for. So it's used in lots of different languages. You might have used it in Angular templates or CoffeeScript, or any of these others. There's a big Wikipedia article with tons of code samples. And it's really widely used in different JavaScript libraries. Lodash and IDX and many others support ways of getting at this sort of functionality. So it seems like a reasonable thing to consider making more straightforward by having this built-in syntax, because all of those examples are relatively more wordy and obscure, as well as harder to optimize in actual JavaScript engines. The second operator is nullish coalescing, and this can be used for default options. When I say options, I mean in the sense of an options bag or an options object. This blog post by Matthew Zoiner explains really well that an options object can be used when you have a bunch of different named parameters that might be optional. It can be much more straightforward to pass them in as properties of an object rather than positional parameters. And so, for example, say we have some function that takes a timeout, like this Ajax method, and we want the timeout to default to 100 if it's not there. So we could use an if statement. Say if options.timeout, then okay, you have your timeout, otherwise default to 100. So that seems pretty good. Analogous to that and pattern, we could also use or here, where or returns the second one if the first one is falsy. So options.timeout or 100, and accordingly it works. If we pass in an object that doesn't have anything, then we get 100. And if we pass in an object that has 1, then we get 1. Well, those two are pretty much equivalent, but I'll just go with the longer one for now. If we pass in 0, then, oh, it fell off the end of the screen, but you actually get 100 out. And you get 100 out if you use the OR syntax as well. And that comes back to this falsiness logic. OR gives you back 1 for any of these. If you 0 or 1, gives 1 rather than 0. Even though something was passed in, it wasn't the right thing. And I think this is a pretty common bug in JavaScript programs, where a lot of people use this OR for defaults, and then encounter these edge cases where they want an empty string or 0 to work, end up having to rewrite their code, but maybe only after the error happened in some worse way. This can be a kind of hard to detect error. So to get around this, you could compare it to undefined, or if you want to be really pedantic, undefined is actually a variable that can be overridden. You can set window.undefined to something else, and then break that check, so you can make it even more robust by using typeof. And then you'll get 0 out, as you expect. But this is getting really complicated. I liked the version with OR, didn't you? To get that back, we have this question mark operator, the nullish coalescing operator, that does exactly what we wanted to do with OR, except it works when we have a timeout of 0 or an empty string. So to give some more examples, some more details, for null or undefined, it will use the default, and for others, it will will give the value provided, even when it's one of those falsy values. So if we do this, we could say question mark is the new OR. Actually, optional chaining and nullish coalescing work really well together. You may have a settings object that's an optional thing inside of another thing, and so we could have a chain of property accesses ending in a optional chain, ending in a null coalesce in order to get the default when the chain fell through. But is that all JavaScript? These are just a bunch of symbols. If you type that into your console, the console is going to say syntax error, that's not JavaScript. But it might be soon. We're looking into it in TC39. These proposals are at stage 1 in JavaScript's, in TC39's process, which I'll explain to you soon. And the champion of the proposals, the sort of project manager, is Gabriel Eisenberg. But who's this TC39? Well, remember ES6 or ES 2015? A bunch of new features were added to JavaScript, such as destructuring. You can declare 2 variables, x and y, and then just swap them using really intuitive array syntax, where you just have an array on the left-hand side and you assign to it, and then that swaps the variables. But who is this group of people who's making all these decisions about how JavaScript should change? It's a committee of ECMA. ECMA is an organization based in Geneva, a standards development organization, but the people who go to these meetings are JavaScript developers as well as implementers, by which I mean people who make JavaScript itself work, like V8 in web browsers and Node, and Babel and TypeScript, as well as people who work on web frameworks and libraries, and academics with a theoretical experience in programming languages, and more. And we work together on this. This document is the JavaScript specification. It's a big HTML document, and it contains the complete definition of what it means to be JavaScript. I wouldn't recommend printing it out. It would come in at 1,200 pages long, but it's really good to search around with sort of some embedded features that it has if you're looking for something in particular. And we develop it here in GitHub. So it's just an open source project like any other with issues and pull requests. We also develop it in meetings. So every 2 months, we meet for 3 days, And we talk about the things that are going on in GitHub, and we also talk about new language proposals, and sometimes move them through the stage process. So the stage process for proposals is, first, at stage 1, we're discussing an idea. The committee hasn't really decided anything more than that we want to discuss the possibility of this feature. By stage 2, we've agreed, yeah, we want to do this feature, and we have a first draft of the specification, the full description of what the feature would be. We have a rough draft, but we're still working through the details. By stage 3, we really have all the details worked out as far as we could, and we're ready to send it off to be properly implemented and tested. And at stage 4, the 2 implementations are complete, we have full tests, and we're ready to say, this is part of the language now. And at that point, once something reaches stage 3, we can take it up as a PR and merge the PR, and then it's part of JavaScript. Well, question mark dot and question mark, optional chaining and null coalescing both reached stage 1. So the committee agreed, yes, we're going to discuss this. And we did discuss it at length in late 2017 and early 2018. But there's still more work to do. It's still not JavaScript yet. So for stage 2, each stage has requirements for reaching it. And so for stage 2, we need a draft of what the specification would look like, which we have. And we also kind of need to have an idea of what the semantics and syntax will be, and kind of be in agreement about the first steps, which we're not really at yet. So next I'll talk about what are some of the open disagreements about the syntax and semantics. And then we also need agreement among the committee that we want to go forward with this proposal, that it's worth it to add a new language feature. So method calls and property accesses. This is a syntax question. So in most programming languages, like if you look at Swift or CoffeeScript, when they add optional chaining, they don't just add properties, they also add methods and array indexing. So above, you might expect this to be question mark paren. So object.method question mark paren arguments. But in JavaScript, that doesn't quite work. The current proposal is to use question mark dot in these cases. So the operator is always question mark dot, and then it might have the property name, or it might have in parentheses a function call, or it might have in square brackets a named property lookup or array index. And why is this? This looks a little bit weird. You don't really expect to have a dot there. But in the JavaScript grammar, we try to avoid look ahead. So if you think about how a parser works operationally, it's scanning the code from left to right, and it's each time it reads a character, it makes a decision about what state the parser goes in next. It can say, okay, I see a quote. Okay, now I'm parsing a string until I reach the end of the quote. And it can also see a question mark, and it can say, okay, great, question mark. This probably looks like an optional chain or null coalescing operator. But question mark also stands in for other things. In particular, it's already the ternary operator, the question mark colon operator, where you have, it's sort of like an if expression. A question mark B colon C is like if A, then B, else C as an expression. So when the parser would be scanning something like object question mark square bracket, it can't tell unless it looks all the way forward to see whether there's a colon, whether it's a ternary operator or an optional chaining operator. And we try to limit look ahead to a fixed number of tokens. So the syntax doesn't work within those grammar constraints. A parser would have to be a sort of backtracking parser rather than fixed look ahead parser. So the current proposal is to do this question mark dot paren or question mark dot square bracket. An alternate proposal is to use 2 question marks. So in this case, you always use 2 question marks, and then that could be followed either by a dot or or a square bracket, or a parenthesis. And then for defaults, we would use 3 question marks. That's sort of a lot of question marks. So this is one current controversy that we're having that will need to get resolved before stage 2. And there's some GitHub issues that you can all chime in on if you're interested in this. Another controversy is the handling of null. Currently, null is treated as sort of a missing value, like undefined. Some people say null and undefined should be treated the same, and some people say undefined should be missing, whereas null is sort of a present value, which is null. So it's another thing. But there's a bigger question about whether we want to add a language feature at all. On one hand, in those examples that I showed you, which I think are pretty common, it makes code cleaner to have access to this construct. And it avoids bugs that you get through misuse of and or on falsy values. But the con is that it's another feature, and other features mean more things for people to learn. Even if you decide that you don't want to use it in your code base, your coworkers may be using it, and you may have to understand their code. So JavaScript is a relatively minimalistic language, and it would be a shame if it got too complex for people to be able to understand. So this is a trade-off that we're continuously trying to make as we examine new features. There's also the option to sort of cut the baby in half and only have optional chaining for properties, but not for functions or indexing. So these are these 2 missing things that we need for stage 2. To get to the plan from here is to just give this some more time. They're implemented in Babel. It's at stage 1, and programmers can experiment with them before it's actually in the language. I bet many of you are using Babel right now, even though the newest versions of browsers have features implemented, or you may be using Babel for things that are not even on a standards track like JSX. Well, now you can use Babel to try out these new language features as well if you opt into them within your Babel RC file. We plan to collect feedback over time through GitHub and through other consultations with developers, and then consider, based on that feedback, whether they should be advanced to stage 2, whether we find that it's worth it, and whether we find that the choices for these cases make sense. Sometimes when we're considering a language feature, there's a downside that it's really complicated to implement, that it's going to sort of run the risk of making all the programs slower. Something like that. That's not the case here. This is going to be really easy for browsers and for TypeScript and for everybody to make it work. But we're just taking our time here to make sure we get the design right. So to get to stage 3, we'll need complete specification text, which, not just a first draft, we'll need a sign-off from both the editor of JavaScript, and also we appoint reviewers from within the committee to do a further sign-off. And then once we get there, we're ready to pass it off to implementers. And then for stage 4, we'll need 2 complete implementations, full tests, and we'll need this pull request prepared with a sign-off from the editor. Well, if you're interested in this proposal moving forward, there's a lot of ways that you can get involved to help it along. So one way is feedback on GitHub issues. I'd love to see comments on GitHub issues for TC39 proposals that talk about whether a feature works for your use cases, for issues that you run into in day-to-day programming. Are there any pieces that are missing? Does it seem like, oh, if we have this, then we should also have that? Or other ways, are there things that seem unnecessary? Are there some cases that it just seems really confusing that it's handled this way and you would expect it to be handled another way? In optional chaining, for one, we've had a lot of development and feedback over GitHub this is the proposal has a lot of stars. There's a lot of people discussing it. We've been discussing the syntax alternatives with this 2 question mark alternative. We've been discussing how null should be handled. There's the question of how minimal or maximal the proposal should be. The proposal used to be actually support many more operations, and then a careful look was taken at usage in other programming languages, and we decided to trim it down a bit. And a lot more issues. There's a lot more debates and complexity than what I've put in the presentation. We also have testing. So test 262 is the is the conformance test suite that we have, which is shared between all the JavaScript engines, and also shared between other projects that are trying to implement JavaScript, not just browsers. And this is what we do when we have a feature. The idea is you have to upstream tests into this particular test suite. What we find is that when there's a gap in the test coverage, that usually corresponds to a difference in how different engines implement the feature. Because when there's a gap, different people end up reading the same specification differently. Even if everybody's doing their best and writes their own unit tests, the interpretations end up differing. And the process of writing these tests also finds a lot of edge cases in the specifications. The original specification author might not have thought things through with the same lens that you do when you're really trying to get into those edge cases. So this is also an open source project. Anyone can make PRs. The maintainers are really welcoming and encouraging of new contributors. And so this PR is from the BigInt proposal, which checks that if you add a BigInt and something that's not a BigInt, then you get a type error. For these proposals, there are no test 262 tests. They could be useful for Babel development. In general, test 262 merges tests for features that are at stage 3. So this would be developed in a branch, but this branch could be very useful. So if you want to help, that's one way. For documentation and education, there are sort of 2 things here. One thing is different programmers have different mental models, and we're always trying to design the new features in JavaScript to be intuitive for a range of different mental models. So educators know from their experience, and a lot of different kinds of people have experience working with programmers at different levels, and it will be great to have more feedback about this to feed into our proposal process. And a separate side of this is we need documentation for the new features, and it can be especially useful to get it early in the design process so we could think through the learning process for the new features. MDN is one great place for documentation about different features of the web platform, and JavaScript is part of that, and it has a very complete JavaScript reference guide. We could definitely use help filling in MDN. We're working more closely with them, and we're trying to fill in the gaps that MDN has with new features. It seems like we may be able to collaborate with them to document even things that are not at stage 4 yet. So for this feature, it might not be ready for inclusion in MDN yet, but it would be great to have more educators' perspective, and also would be great to have more introductory materials prepared. Right now, the only materials we have is we have sort of a README in both proposals that describes how it works, but it's a bit different from what you would give to beginner. Then implementation. Of course, these proposals need to actually be implemented in a transpiler or a JavaScript JIT in order for people to use them. Luckily, the JavaScript ecosystem is consisting really largely of open source projects that are welcoming of new contributors. And even if a feature isn't part of JavaScript yet, even if it isn't officially stage 4, these can be developed behind a flag, in a plugin, or sometimes in a branch. Babel is a great place to develop new features. Optional chaining and nullish coalescing have been implemented in Babel, and if you use a Babel 7.0 pre-release, then you can use these plugins. Actually, React Native shipped with optional chaining turned on by default. And so thank you to Justin and Lucas for your great work there. But there's still more different places that you can implement these in, for example, syntax highlighters or parsers. If you tried to implement this in V8, you might be maintaining this in your own branch for a while, because most advanced implementations don't accept features that are not stage 3 yet. You can also attend TC39 as a delegate and participate in the conversations in the committee. To join TC39 as a delegate, you join ECMA, and you can contact me for more details there. So, it would be great if you're interested in giving more feedback or input to TC39, you can get involved at tc39.github.io. And optional chaining and nullish coalescing are at stage 1. And I'm Daniel Ehrenberg, so thank you very much.